Welcome to Round Camera Square Photo. My name is John. Today we're going to be talking about the Sony A6000. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and should you be buying this camera in 2020. Let's start with a little bit of history. The Sony A6000 was my camera for around 5 years. I picked this camera up a long time ago. It was actually a gift from my grandmother. As she said, I seem to like photography so much, I might as well should go get a real camera. I did a lot of research, and back then the Sony A6000 was the camera that a lot of people were flocking to over some of the other Canon and Nikon counterparts. This camera has a lot of specs going for it. To start out with, it is a 24 megapixel sensor. It is an APS-C sensor, so it's going to be a crop sensor. Obviously, you're not getting full frame for $500. It uses the NP-FW50 battery type, which is kind of the small battery, and we'll talk about battery life in a little bit. This thing has 11 FPS continuous shooting and 179 autofocus points. I think that's something that needs to be said more, because originally when I had this camera and I was using it, I didn't even think about the continuous high FPS shooting. But when I was doing research for this review, and I was thinking about when I was looking at other cameras, I didn't even realize that something like the Canon Rebel T6i is only running a high continuous shooting of 5 FPS, which is insane that this little guy, which is little more than half the price, is shooting 11 FPS, and you can feel that. You can definitely feel 11 FPS when you shoot with this camera. So let's talk about the camera in the most basic configuration most people are gonna buy. They're probably gonna buy it with the body and the kit lens. Now, when I bought this camera, I let it sit for about a year because it really didn't impress me that much. And there's some reasons behind that, mostly related to the kit lens. The kit lens Sony includes with this camera does not do it any justice. It is not the sharpest. It has a variable f-stop of 3.5 to 5.6 as you zoom in, so you're not getting great bokeh. It does have OSS, so if you're looking for a quick video camera lens to just walk around with, it does have optical steady shot. Overall build quality of the lens just does not, it's metal, it's the same material as the main body, it just doesn't feel great. And one of the key things I want to make note of is that for some reason it loves to break. And what I mean by that is if you're running a Canon DSLR, the Rebel T6, T3i, any of those, or any of the Nikons, their kit lens is it's a manual kit lens in terms of zooming. So it's just all internally mechanical. And, it doesn't, when the camera turns on, you're not worried about, the lens not working usually, unless you actually broke the internal mechanism. This lens, however, when you turn it on, it does this little zoom thing, like it actually comes out, kind of like a lot of point and shoot cameras do. The problem with it is, if you drop the camera, there's a really good chance you might break the internal motors in that lens housing, and then the lens is just shot. In the 5 years I've owned the camera, I've dropped it plenty of times, and almost every single time it broke the kit lens if I had it on it. I've dropped this camera with other lenses on it that it's been a tank. The body is a tank. It has never broken on me since I bought it, but the kit lens has broken plenty of times. And I think that I don't understand what Sony's idea with this kit lens was. I think it's just the idea of having a really compact package, and that was their main selling point. The problem is it just doesn't do this camera justice. When you buy this, and if you were to go shoot, your kids' sports or whatever with this kit lens, you're going to be extremely disappointed. The only thing I think this kit lens is remotely okay for is going to be architecture and landscape photography. And even then, you're not getting super great quality images. Some people do manage to get really good images out of that kit lens. I know I have a hard time getting it to work, and maybe it's my kit lens. The main thing to get out of it is, I think once you slap better glass on this body, it's when this body starts to shine. When I upgraded the kit lens to the 50mm f1.8 from Sony, which is the default, next step up, nifty 50 lens everybody should get, it blew my mind with how great the image quality was. Here's some images that I shot of a model that I know. The images that come off of this camera are absolutely superb. When you start throwing good glass on this body, The sensor it's a fantastic sensor. The image quality is insane. You just have to throw good glass in front of it. We're going to revisit that in a little bit. I want to talk about some of the features of the camera that make it so it can be such a powerful workhorse. First off, obviously you have that 11 FPS if you want to shoot sports. I shot football, I've shot some basketball, I've shot a lot of sports on this camera, and surprisingly got really good results. Is it a 1DX Mark II? No. Is it a 1DX? No. But is it a good camera for sports? If you're shooting with 11 FPS, it's going to be better than a lot of your standard level DSLRs at similar price points. It's going to be your best option. Now, obviously, you have to get used to the electronic viewfinder. You see the shot before you take it. I think for a lot of beginner photographers, this is extremely important, as when I was shooting with a Nikon DSLR before this, one of the things I got so frustrated about is you would take a picture and you look down and it wouldn't even look remotely like what you just looked through a viewfinder. Obviously, it's an optical viewfinder. That was 13-year-old John. Now I'm 21-year-old John, and I understand why that happens. But if you're a younger photographer or you're new to photography and maybe you haven't watched a million tutorials on settings yet, like I have, you might not understand why that's happening. And for a beginner photographer, being able to pick up the camera, turn it on, and what you see is what you get, kind of similar to your smartphone, is somewhat important, I think. I think it helps you learn what the settings mean. When you're in auto, obviously, it'll show you what the settings are, but once you switch it over to manual mode, you can start messing with the settings. You can start seeing what the f-stop does, what the shutter speed does, what does your ISO do, and it helps you kind of create that mind connection of, as I increase the shutter speed, my picture gets darker, but things are less blurry. As I decrease the f-stop, my depth of field gets shallower. Once you start making those connections before you're even taking the photos, I think it helps create that connection to the point where once you've been using it for multiple years, you no longer are relying on the EVF. I use the EVF, but I don't rely on it as much anymore. I just kind of know my settings, and I can kind of dial myself in without having to look at the EVF and go, oh, is this correct? It's a really helpful tool though, especially if you're in changing situations, say event photography. I've been at basketball games and shooting, and for some reason at one end of the court, the lighting is one way, and at the other end of the court, the lighting's completely different, and you have to change. If you dial yourself in for one side, but then aren't checking your photos or aren't mindfully thinking about it, half your photos are going to be bad. But if you're using an EVF, you already are seeing the change as you're moving around, because your camera's like, it's not going to look good. Some other good pieces about the camera are, it is compact, it is small. This can be a good or a bad thing, depending on what you're looking for. If you want that professional feel, it definitely sometimes feels like you're playing around with a toy compared to your 5D Mark IV counterparts or the big bulky DSLRs. But I will say, the camera, with it being so small and compact, you usually can get it into places sometimes that you couldn't get other bigger cameras. I've been to plenty museums and gotten some cool photos of some animals and some sculptures and such that I couldn't have gotten if I would have had a big DSLR, because they ban interchangeable lens cameras. But you can get one of these bad boys in, and they don't even think it's an interchangeable lens camera because it looks like a bulky point and shoot from 2009. Another small problem with this camera, and something to keep in mind, but it's not that big of an issue, is going to be your battery life. A lot of people complain that this camera has not the best battery life. That FP 70 battery, this little guy, is rated for, I think, 350 shots. It's some really small number. Honestly speaking, I usually get way more out of the battery than most people think you should be, especially if you get some aftermarket batteries. They typically have a little bit more juice in them, and honestly, I haven't had a problem with battery function in the A6000. Some other limitations of the camera, I will tell you, I don't recommend the camera for video. It does tend to overheat the processor in it, and heat dissipation is not good. It also has a default recording limit of 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes, the camera is just going to shut off on you. And sometimes if you don't realize that, you'll be recording a video and all of a sudden, boop, it just turns off and just shuts off while you're talking. It doesn't have a flip-up screen, doesn't have a touch screen. For some people, this is a deal breaker. For me, as a photography camera, it doesn't matter. The touch screen on the A6400 is nice, but you don't need it when you're shooting with the A6000 because you just kind of get used to using the dials and buttons and stuff. Overall, the A6000 is a fantastic camera once you throw good glass on it. I usually recommend you throw on the Sony 50mm f1.8 or the Sigma 56mm f1.4 that's being used to film this video right now. You have the Sigma 16, the Sigma 35. Those lenses really make this camera shine, to the point where when I was out shooting with this camera, I was shooting up against people using 5D Mark IIs through 4s, 1DX Mark IIs, 1DXs. My photos were getting put into the pile of usable photos with their photos. And I think that attests to cameras that cost over, $1,500, $2,000. This camera's a $500 package using a lens that's like, what, $300 for a Sigma? That's maybe a $700 package that I'm getting very usable, great photos that are being put up on, university pages and such. And people really like them. People are blown away by the photos that have come off of this camera. And so I think it attests to how powerful the sensor is, how powerful the technology is, and the fact that you just need to throw good glass on it. And obviously, yes, any camera can excel with good glass, but I feel like the Sony especially just has this ability to really shine with its sensor and the mirrorless technology. Now, obviously, when it comes to price, typically this camera is like a $500 camera with a kit lens. Now there is the Sony A6000 that just recently came out. I do not have my hands on that camera. I've not tried that camera, but spec-wise, it definitely seems better. It has some better features. What I'm hoping to do is to get that camera in and kind of do a comparison over the two cameras to see which one you should buy. Do I recommend buying the A6000 new? Probably not. It is a little bit of an older camera. If you can pick it up used, even though the Sony used market isn't fantastic, if you can pick it up used, try to, and see if you can get it for a deal around maybe $300. This camera will blow your mind once you put some good glass in. It's just a matter of learning your equipment and understanding the limitations of it and what it can do. So I definitely think this is worth it for an entry-level beginner shooter, somebody that's new to photography but wants to be able to expand into high-tier photography because it has the specs that can keep up with other higher tier cameras. And hopefully throughout this video I've thrown up some images that can help show that off, because as much as I can talk about how good the camera is, if you can't see it, then there's no point. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed my take on the Sony A6000. I've used this camera forever and I freaking love it. I only just upgraded to the 6400 recently, and that's going to be the next review coming up shortly on Round Camera Square Photo. If you liked it, hit like. If you want to see more reviews and my stupid face talking about cameras, go ahead and hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.